Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I have a few clarifications for Minister before I thank him for his statement, which a lot of information, or some information at least, the public has heard for the first time today and here in the House. I have a few questions. First, when did the government first inform SPH that it was prepared to extend grants to support its media business? Secondly, what is the size of the funding the government has penciled yearly to support the SPH CLG? Does the government aim to cap the grants it extends with the expectation that the CLG would also secure other sources of funding from the private sector, for example? The third question is, with respect to some public documents that were released by SPH last week. It was decided that the SPH contribution towards the CLG would be, was, I quote, arrived at after considering various factors, including the potential funding requirements of the media business for a few years, unquote. Does the ministry consider this contribution to be a reasonable one? And how did it come to this conclusion? My final two questions, what structures will the government insist on to ensure the independence of the SPH CLG from possible government interference, to foster a culture of editorial and to foster a culture of editorial independence across its titles? And finally, in view of the significant change in this sector, would the government consider the formation of a select committee to allow members of the public and Singaporeans in particular to A, express what editorial standards they expect from the CLG taxpayer-funded mainstream media, and B, to express their views on how best the SPH CLG can ensure editorial independence from any government of the day? Thank you.
Minister.
So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his series of questions. They span a wide range of issues. I will attempt to give him a comprehensive response, but I imagine this is going to be further developed in subsequent clarifications. First, on the issue of timing, about when did we inform SPH that we're willing to fund SPH, I think, as I said in my statement, the government has always taken the position that we are willing to support investments in capability development, and then it is up to the respective organizations to develop their plan and to put forward their proposals to us. In the case of SPH specifically, as I mentioned, last year they received the JSS, which was part of the national scheme. In addition, we were prepared to offer extra help if it was required, but the restructuring proposal was put to us, which then leads to the next question about other sources of funding and whether government funding to the CLG will be capped. Mr. Speaker, I would say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would say that it's premature to specify the exact numbers that will go in regard to the government funding. And the reason for this is not because we are reluctant to talk about them, but it's simply because, first, this is still a matter before the shareholders of SPH. They have to decide whether they want to approve this. It is only after that that we can really get into a more detailed discussion. But it's not just about the shareholders' approval. We also need the new CLG to then formulate its plans and put on the table what it sees as its strategic business direction going forward. And in that matrix, the different sources of revenues that it expects or anticipates, and what role will the government funding be or play in that matrix. So the question of whether other sources of funding will be required, I think if the Leader of the Opposition had heard earlier from my speech, not-for-profit does not mean that the entity does not pursue its business on a commercial basis. And we fully expect the entity to seek out advertising revenue, circulation or subscription revenue, and other sources of funding. But we fully expect that government funding will be a component of that funding matrix for the CLG. He asked if the SPH contribution, which has been spelled out, which includes the transfer of 2 property assets which are related to the media business, and also some other operating businesses which are linked to the media, in addition to the $80 million of cash and $30 million of SPH shares and REITs. And he asked whether this is reasonable, why. Again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to stress that because this is a matter that has to be put to the shareholders at an EGM, I do not want to preempt any case that the management and the board will make. But I can say that our focus, the government's focus, has been very clearly on the news media business and its viability going forward. Whilst I am unable to say specifics about what the numbers look like in the near term, SPH has said some about how they think it will continue to widen in terms of its deficit. I can say that the medium to long-term outlook remains challenging, and that is why we need to be clear that government will be prepared to come in to give support. But how much, how, I think these are the things that will need to be worked out in due course after the CLG has had a chance, subject to shareholder approval, to then develop a business plan and put the proposal to us. The member asked about structures for editorial independence or ensuring a culture of editorial independence. I would venture that that culture already exists in Singapore, in the news media. And I think we do a disservice to our journalists and editors to suggest anything to the contrary. And in fact, if you look at the overall outcome that we have achieved over the years, it speaks to, not just from external sources that validate by recognizing the accomplishments of our local news media, but importantly, and this has a bearing on the Leader of the Opposition's last point on a select committee, because if I understand correctly, it's about enabling people to express their views. I would say Singaporeans have already expressed their views because, first, when it comes to trust surveys, Singapore scores highly. Singaporeans have been quick to point out that they trust our news media, both print and broadcast, and they've shared this, and I cited the YouGov survey and also the Edelman Trust report. I would add that even our local surveys, for example, by the IPS, validate this, saying that about 70% of Singaporeans, or 7 out of 10, trust our local media. And that is at a higher level than the trust they accord international media, I would add. So it's not just what they say, though, it's also what they are doing. What are their habits? What are their preferences? In other words, how are they voting with, in this case, their eyeballs? And the fact is, as I said, and I want to re-emphasize, the SPH news organizations in aggregate have not just maintained, but they have grown their reach and readership. when you combine the digital and the physical. That would not be the case if Singaporeans did not feel that they could trust the news organization. So I think the people have spoken, and I think it's our job now to make sure the object of their trust continues to succeed.
Mr. Darrell David.
I have a couple of supplementary questions for the Minister. First of all, Minister, the government does provide funding to the new entity, the new CLG called SPH Media. I think it's reasonable if you provide the funding to have some expectations, to have some accountability, to have even some conditions. Can Minister perhaps develop on what are some of the accountabilities or even the KPIs that the government will expect from the new CLG in return for the funding? And of course, with that accountability, with that expectation, there could also be the criticism that therefore that's a way also of exerting control over the CLG. Could Minister perhaps also expound on some measures that could be put in place to balance off between expecting accountability, but yet at the same time having a hands-off approach and not necessarily shaping or influencing how the CLG would then do its business? Thank you, Minister.
So, Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for his questions. First, on accountability and conditions or KPIs tied to the funding. Again, I want to start by saying this is still a matter that has to be approved by the shareholders of SPH before we can start talking about these matters in greater detail. But I can talk about it in terms of broad principles. Clearly, and as I said in my ministerial statement, we want to do this, and by this I mean the funding of the CLG, with financial discipline and accountability in areas like digital innovation and capability development. And what does that mean? It means that if the funding is given for a specific purpose, then the expectation is, and in this case it's about building capabilities, for example, then the expectation must be that those capabilities are indeed developed. But it goes beyond that, because the development of capabilities in the end is a means to a more important end. And that end is sustaining, if not growing, the attention, the readership, and the following from Singaporeans. It is something that both MediaCorp and ST have been doing, the SPH news groups have been doing with significant success over the years, but clearly it is something that we will want them to continue to strive to achieve. Because at the end of the day, if you do not have the eyeballs, the attention of people, then the effort, in a sense, will ring hollow. And our objective when we talk about a trusted, professional, high-quality news organizations, the ultimate measure of it, as I said in my response to the Leader of the Opposition, is in how our citizens respond to it and how much attention they give it, whether it's in terms of readership, dwell time, and this is especially so in a moment of crisis, which is when the truth and reliability of information becomes even more critical. On the point about control, I think I had said some of this in my earlier response, but perhaps I could. I think first, let me acknowledge that it is inevitable that whenever you have a change, in this case, structural change in the organization, such concerns will naturally arise. It is inevitable and it's quite understandable. But I think as we deliberate on this and we discuss this in this chamber, we also need to keep in mind, where are we starting from? when thinking about the future. We are starting from a position where we have two news organizations, media organizations, one a core newspaper group with radio and online presence, another a core broadcaster with radio and online presence. So some overlap, but distinct core competencies. And these organizations have developed under our existing model. And what I mean by that is SPH is subject to the NPPA and the restrictions that go with it. MediaCorp gets funding from the government in the form of public service broadcasting. And in both cases, they have been able to pursue their editorial policy in a manner that has allowed them to win the trust of Singaporeans, as evinced by the various studies and surveys and so on, and also the reading habits of Singaporeans. So, if I may put it another way, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we have something that is working. The part that is challenging is the financial model in particular. We need the business must be given enough time to be able to transition to a more sustainable business model. And that is something that we are now committed to do by rendering support to the CLG, but without changing the nature of the relationship that we have today between these news organizations and the government and MCI.
Ms. Jessica Tan.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have two clarifications for Minister. Minister, you spoke about the impact of digital disruptions on the news media industry. And while digital investments in funding are important to maintain quality local news media, this clearly is not enough. In fact, SPH has actually grown its digital footprint as well as its viewership. The challenge has been viability. So what will be different for the CLG to achieve the digital pivot, as Minister has said is required? A clear strategy to transform and to drive digital innovation is required. And how will this new entity achieve that? My second question is a different one, but an important one to maintaining the core of the quality of local journalism, and that is really its people. And in this case, it's the journalists themselves, as well as the experienced team that produce the content. So what is being done to ensure that this retention of talent is there, as well as, more importantly, the ability for the new entity to attract new talent required to do the pivots it requires?
So, Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for her questions, which are both, I think, very important. Perhaps I start with the people question first. One cannot talk about quality journalism without talking about quality journalists. It's indivisible, and indeed, when we talk about investing in the capability of our news media, this is one of the key attributes. The ability to attract, retain, and develop talent, journalistic talent, which can take our news media industry forward, both for the quality of its news reporting and also for its analysis of global events, local events, and to be able to offer that distinctly Singapore perspective which we need for all the reasons I've outlined. So we are very clear that when it comes to the people element, it is something that must continue to be supported. How that is done is a matter that the company itself must take forward. And what I mean by this is this. So, for example, if we think back to the job support scheme, the objective was very simple: to prevent attrition of capabilities that have been developed and that are needed for the future. But what we need, I think, in the context of SPH now is not just the prevention of attrition, but actually the ability to build on that capability, which I think is the point that the member makes as well. And so I think this is an area which the new CLG chairman, the board and the management will be seized with. And I would imagine as part of their strategic business review, the human dimension is going to be key, because ultimately that is what sustains the news media. Having said that, the earlier point about what will be different, and I agree with the member, financial support or money alone is not enough. I think really it's about what you are using these resources for, and therefore what will be different. As I pointed out, I think the current structure, whilst there has been a considerable effort on the part of SPH to pivot to digital, and they've made the investments I've mentioned, about $50 million a year over 5 years. But really, they need to do more, and they need to do it in a more purposeful and quick way. I think that is something that if you talk to the editors and the journalists, they will say, and that is also the experience that we see around the world. So therefore, I think first, the fact that you are now moving out of a listco structure into a CLG model will give the company the opportunity to dedicate the resources it needs for this purpose. And that is where I think the support from government will also be important. And I would say that the other thing is, in terms of again, I think the point that the member makes, and the member would be very familiar with this, it's not just about tech, it's about how that tech is applied in the context of this vertical and how it is used to deliver a product that is valued by the customers, the readers, and whether there are different ways to find new revenue sources arising from that. So this is a very important area of work. I know that within the current SPH system, they've put some degree of effort into it. But going forward, I think the CLG and the management will have to bring in talent in addition to what they already have within to address this in a very direct way and start making the decisive strategic moves in that regard. So I think the ability to make such moves and then back them with the resources and then find the talent to back it up, these are all going to be important differentiating factors in the change that's being proposed under the restructuring.
Mr. Liang Eng Hua.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. Sir, we understand the severe commercial challenges faced by SPH Media as a standalone entity, as a listco, and would require government funding to support, to put them on a more sustainable path. So I have two clarifications for ministers. Firstly, how did the government arrive at the decision that the CLG structure is the best option? And second clarification is, have the government considered other options, such as privatizing SPH, so that the media unit is not subjected to the market returns pressure, very much like the SMRT, or even the Media Corp approach, where the government support the company with annual public service broadcast grants?
So, Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for his questions. How do we arrive at the CLG structure, and were alternatives considered? First, we have to be very clear how the proposal came about. This is the result of SPH management and board assessing their business, in particular the media business and its prospects going forward, and then putting forward a proposal which in their assessment achieves best the objective of ensuring the viability and success of the media business going forward, freed from the constraints of a listed company and its reporting structures and so on. So that's how it came about. And this, I want to emphasize again, is a proposal that awaits shareholder approval. So I do not want to go into a detailed discussion on its merits, but as I have said quite clearly, the government supports it. We're supporting it not because of the shareholder value proposition, that is for SPH and its management and its directors and independent financial advisor and independent directors to explain to their shareholders. We support it from the perspective of what needs to be done to secure the long-term sustainability of a quality, trusted news media in Singapore. That's the focus. So other ideas, whether it's privatization and other formulations, I think these are questions that I'm sure the board and management would have considered. But I also want to point out that from the government's point of view, the regulatory levers are quite specific. They only pertain to decisions that affect the news media business in the way I've explained. So I think the larger issues around the business, its viability, its decisions on what can be done for shareholder value, ultimately is something that the board and management have to decide on and propose to shareholders to agree. Then I think the member asked the question, is it possible for us to support the company in this present form, I assume, with something like public service broadcasting funding and so on? Can it be considered? I think the answer is obviously yes. But is that a good model? I think that's debatable. Why is that debatable? Because I understand the intent of the member. In other words, the business is within the ListCo. It is having some challenges. Can we just direct the funding to that operation in that business for it to succeed? The problem is, if we channel a certain amount of funding to the listed company, and the listed company then makes profits, and then it distributes dividends to its shareholders, the question that then can be asked is this a case of taxpayers subsidizing returns to shareholders? So there is an issue there. And so then it means, do we need to find other constructs to deal with it? And I don't want to labor the point, but other than to say that I don't think it is a straightforward solution. I think it is fraught in its own way. So what we have before us is the proposal that the board and management of SPH put to us after their own deliberations of various possibilities. Our lens is purely from the point of view of how do we ensure a quality, professional, trusted news media continues to succeed in Singapore. And that's the basis on which we have expressed our approval for the restructuring.
Ms. Sylvia Lim.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. First, I'd like to say that I welcome Minister's statements in his speech that the government and SPH media will not see eye to eye on matters, and it is as it should be if the newspapers are to be credible to readers. I welcome that statement strongly. At the same time, he has acknowledged that due to the proposed change in the funding, there are some concerns about the implications of government funding on the editorial direction of the newspaper. And in the same breath, he just announced to us today that the government and the management shareholders of SPH have agreed on the choice of the chair of the CLG to be Mr. Corbin Wan. I have some clarifications on this choice. First, let me clarify that I'm not questioning the personal integrity of Mr. Kaur, but the fact is that he is the former chairman of the People's Action Party and former coordinating minister for infrastructure. So I'd like to ask Minister, first of all, the choice of Mr. Kaur, although he said it was by agreement between the government and the management shareholders, am I to assume that it was the government's suggestion that Mr. Kaur take on this role and the management shareholders agreed to that suggestion? Second question, does Minister not see this as a missed opportunity in the light of the major restructure that is coming up and some concerns about what this would mean for newspaper content? Is this not a missed opportunity where someone else who is not so closely linked to the government could have been chosen to be the chair? Were any other candidates considered? Thank you.
So, Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for her clarifications. Let me just be very clear. I said in my statement that the news media and the government will not always see eye to eye. I don't think the definition of a good news media or a credible news media is that it must always not see eye to eye, but it has the occasion when it's necessary to be able to do so. So I want to be clear about that. Second, I think the nub of the question really is that with Mr. Corbin Wan being asked by the management shareholders to chair the CLG, whether this creates problems from the point of view of editorial independence. I presume that's your main point. And let me put this in a very, I think let's start with where we are today. SPH's current chairman is Dr. Lee Boon Yang, and he is a former cabinet minister. In SPH's history, they have had other chairpersons who have either been ex-senior civil servants or ex-cabinet ministers. MediaCorp's chairman today is an ex-senior civil servant. And yet, we are where we are today, and I do not wish to canvass the arguments all over again, but we are where we are today in terms of the credibility of our media, the trust that Singaporeans have in our media, through this array of leadership. And I think we should therefore be very clear that what matters is not a perceived political hue in the appointments, but rather in the substance of the character and capability of the people who are involved. And I think in that regard, Mr. Corbin Wan, I think, will be, he's held in high standing in Singapore by many and so beyond Singapore. And he has a proven track record of taking on difficult issues and working on them. And this is one such issue. And what you need is someone at the leadership level who has the gravitas, has the strategic vision, and the experience in undertaking these sorts of major tasks. And make no mistake about it, this is a major undertaking, and it is one that is of national importance. So I think the choice of Mr. Korbun is something that not just the government, but in fact the management shareholders were very keen on. And as I said, it was a discussion that we had. This is not the kind of position for which you have a very long shortlist, or that would do a global search, you know. In the end, you have to decide on the basis of what is needed, what are the attributes we seek, and how do we go forward. And that's what happened here. And I think, therefore, is this a missed opportunity? I think what would be a missed opportunity is if we allow political considerations to prevent us from making the right decision in terms of the right person for the job to get it done. And I think that's what we have sought to do.
Ms. Mariam Jafar.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, as a consultant in the area of technology, media, and telecommunications, I want to say that the proposed transfer to a non-profit structure for SPH, away from the glare of investor expectations, seems to make sense, and will give the SPH group more time to fundamentally transform. But, as said by Minister, it's no panacea. I have two clarifications to ask of the Minister, building on some of the questions earlier raised by the member Jessica Tan. First, how will SPH Media Group maximize this opportunity for a fresh start? Which means essentially answering the question, what can you sell that is insightful, relevant, and distinctive, and provides an engaging audience experience? To whom and at what price? Which will likely have to be consumer pay, because advertising is not going to cut it. The fundamental source of competitive advantage here has become distribution, and has moved to the digital giants. And with what technology to support all this? And how can you operate at a drastically lower level of cost in order to make money? Including, for example, by moving to much more greenfield tech platforms. I recognize these are questions for the CLG, really. But I think what I would like to know is there an ambition within the CLG to think of SPH Media Group now more as a startup to benefit from this fresh start rather than incremental thinking? How will the new entity be able to attract a visionary CEO in addition to talented journalists and editors, but also tech people who see the noble mission of providing quality, independent journalism? In particular, can a bigger voice or a greater role be accorded to the internal staff, some of whom I know have been pushing for change for a long time and love their jobs as SPH journalists, in spite of the business uncertainty and in spite of all the accusations that they have partisan motives? They could have really good ideas under bold and inspiring leadership. My second clarification, and this is regarding to vernacular newspapers. I would like to know if the preservation of Berita Harian and other vernacular newspapers will be an explicit condition for government funding, or if funding is given by other sources, will there be a mechanism to ensure that these vernacular newspapers, so important to our nation building, are explicitly retained? Finally, I just want to say that journalism has always and will continue to benefit from various forms of subsidy, support, and benevolence from various actors. Why? Because as Joseph Pulitzer once said, our republic and its press will rise and fall together. So we do need solutions that enable high-quality, independent journalism, not least local news and vernacular news, informing the communities about the events and people affecting their lives. Thank you.
Minister, would you like to reply to those clarifications?
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I thank the member for first the note of optimism that she has struck, because in discussing this, the merits, the challenges, the concerns, and so on, I think we must not lose sight of the fact that this is an opportunity for the organization and the people within to embark on their journey that they have traveled on up to now, but with a new beginning. And I think that is the key thing. And in considering that, I do want to make the point, because the member said, will this CLG behave like a startup, or will there be just incremental change? And I think the best way I would put it is this. You want the zest, the energy, the drive, the invention of a startup, but you do not want to lose the credibility, the trust, the quality, the people that you have nurtured all through these years. So we want to have our cake and eat it. We want to be able to do both. And I think it's very important that we recognize that, because it's not about jettisoning everything and starting from scratch, but neither is it about being so hidebound that we are not prepared to discard some of the older or long-held propositions from a business point of view in order to pursue new ideas. So I think we need a bit of both, or rather we need a lot of both. And this is where I think, as the member has mentioned, the staff, the people who are within, are just as important as the people who are without, who will be brought in due course to complement the capability of the organization. Because I think the people who have been with the organization, the journalists, the editors, the other staff, they bring a very valuable perspective. And I think that has to be a part of the equation going forward, just as we need to bring in, whether it's technology-oriented people, but others who will be able to contribute and complement. And therefore, I think the most important thing here is having a team that brings together the best capabilities in order to maximize the chance of success for this new CLG venture. And I think this is something Mr. Korbunwan and I'm sure the team would be very seized with, including a process of finding not just an appropriate CEO, but filling other talent requirements within the organization. The member raised another very important point which pertains to the vernacular media. As I said, the stresses that the industry is under today, and in particular SPH media, means that if nothing were done, then the capacity within the newsrooms would diminish because cost-cutting would be inevitable. And I think amongst the first and most at risk will be the vernacular media, because they have got a smaller circulation. And if you take a purely business logic to this, then I think the outcomes can be quite detrimental from a national cohesion point of view. And so certainly, as I have said, we want to preserve the voice of our vernacular media. This is an important part of what my colleague Mr. Edwin Tong has called the tapestry of Singapore society. And we have to make sure that we pull that and ensure that that remains an important part of the overall entity that is the CLG and all its news media operations. So I think we would want to be very clear about this aspect, but how they achieve it is, I think, a different matter. So if I can put it another way, the members' questions were around what are they going to do, how are they going to do it, whom are they going to do it for, and what price are they going to impose, and the financial model. All of these are very important questions, but they're not questions that the government should be answering, because ultimately we have to put it to the board, management, and for them to come back and tell us exactly what they have in mind, what are the pivots and changes, maybe even reinvention they envisage, and in that context, then what we need to do or what we can do from the government to support them.
I see many hands. It looks like many members want to be part of this narrative, this important narrative. I'd ask for the members to keep their clarification short so that I can call on both sides of the House and give each member who wants to speak a chance to speak. So clarifications very short, please. Mr. Leon Pereira.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So very briefly, as we've been enjoined to do, I think with this latest move, the government seems to acknowledge that commercially it is very challenging to run media operations, hence the transition to the CLG structure. Given this context and given the NPPA regime where broadsheet newspapers need to obtain NPPA licenses, going forward, will the government consider practicing a light touch in awarding licenses to Singaporean-owned companies who feel that they might want to enter the space and give it a go because they feel that they can innovate and somehow overcome, these commercial hurdles, as some media organizations in other parts of the world, like The Guardian in the UK, for example, have done. Secondly, I welcome the Minister's emphasis that the new entity must be seen to be non-partisan, objective, and independent, and to that end, would the Minister consider either the CLG doing this or the government doing this to set up KPIs that are regularly measured to ensure that the public actually believes in the independence of the new CLG, in its editorial independence, and to measure that regularly, given that taxpayer monies will be pumped in? And lastly, I'd just like to ask a question about how senior editorial appointments in the new CLG will be made. So in his memoirs, the former chief of SPH, Mr. Chong Yip Sing, wrote on page 432, and I quote, "The Newspaper and Printing Presses Act gives the government veto powers over who gets to edit newspapers," unquote. Now, he's referring to his experience some time ago. I asked a PQ more recently about whether the government plays a role in newspaper editorial.
Mr. Pereira, could you just ask your clarification?
Yeah. So it appears that the government doesn't. So my question would be, would the minister consider creating a structure within the CLG to ensure that senior editorial appointments are seen to be independent and safeguarded from any kind of influence whatsoever, and that is seen to be the case? Thank you.
Your indulgence, just I thank the member for his questions. The first is NPPA and whether we would have a light touch and allow more entries into the market. First of all, I think when we are addressing this, let's diagnose the situation correctly. As I said, the issue is not around NPPA or no NPPA restrictions. It's not around government funding or not government funding. It's actually a circumstance that is the result of technological trends which have now made the financial model of the news media a much more challenging one. So we need to address that squarely first. But can we allow more entries into the market? I think we have a fairly vibrant news media. I'm not sure that they're all going to be in the traditional mode. You would know that, for example, we have some newer players like the motherships, like Rice Media and so on. And I think what we are essentially saying is, on the one, you have to look at it as an overall ecosystem. And it is an ecosystem where we will have new entrants coming in. You will also have some of our traditional mainstream media, in this case MediaCorp, as well as SPH News. And we also have the international media who have a very strong presence here in Singapore. So we have to look at it on an ecosystem perspective. It's not about singularly pursuing one aspect, but it's trying to ensure the overall local media grows and is able to hold its own vis-a-vis some of the broader competition it faces and the challenges we've talked about. So that's the context in which I think we will look at it. Secondly, KPIs. Will there be KPIs for... I think it's... I understand what the member is saying, and if I could refer him back to what I said in my earlier comments, not just in the ministerial statement, but subsequently. In fact, that has been one of the key things we look at. So as I've said, it's not just what Singaporeans say, which is important in surveys, etc. It's also what they do in terms of which sites do they go to, how many page views are you getting, what is the dwell time, and so on. And these are all metrics, and I think the member would be very aware that there are various metrics that can be used in order to measure this, the engagement of the audience. And this is certainly something that we would want to ensure is achieved. And I think if people do not trust our local media as a credible source of information, then I think these metrics will suffer. I wanted to just make one clarification. On senior editorial appointments, the government does not exercise a veto on those appointments. The decisions on those are made by management. Shareholders have a say in that matter. So I think just to be very clear, the government, has a say on some other matters, but when it comes to the senior editorial appointments, it's all subject to the management shareholders' approval.
It's Nadia Samdin.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir. I've got two clarifications, please. First, we know that journalists play a critical role in society and nation building. I would like to ask, what impact will the restructured model have on the lives and livelihoods of existing SPH media employees? In addition, is there likely to be any further downsizing as part of the transfer of SPH's media business to the CLG? And if so, will the government ensure that any employees in transition are supported? My second clarification in Malay, please, sir, adding on to my honourable colleague Ms. Mariam Jaffar's question earlier. Akhbar tempatan seperti Berita Harian memainkan peranan penting sebagai sumber berita dan informasi bagi masyarakat kami, terutama sekali bagi warga senja kita, dan mengetengahkan kisah-kisah kebanggaan, minat dan keprihatinan masyarakat. Saya ingin bertanya, sama ada pembiayaan pemerintah kepada CLG baru ini akan merangkumi sokongan kepada bilik berita bahasa ibunda untuk mendakapi transformasi pendigitalan dan memastikan para pembaca akan terus ada pilihan dan mutu akhbar yang terbaik dalam bahasa ibunda kita. Thank you.
So, Deputy Speaker, I thank the member. I share her, and I think we all do, the desire to ensure that our journalists continue to be able to pursue rewarding, fulfilling careers in this very important profession. And indeed, we want to ensure that that continues to be the case even after this restructuring. Specifically, are there any retrenchments, rationalization? The terms of the proposal, as I understand it as of now, is to have the entire team move over, and therefore no attritions are intended. And I also believe that the desire is more to build on the capabilities that we have and to see how we can attract new talent to augment what is already in there. So I think the first order of business for the chairman and the CLG board and management would really be to, amongst other things, as I said in response earlier to Ms. Jessica Tan, is really that it's not just about the business aspects and the financial aspects, but it's also about the people aspects. And this must be given importance. And this is something that we, from the government perspective, we think it's critical. Because, to reiterate a point I made earlier, it doesn't make sense to talk about quality journalism if you do not have the quality journalists and editors in the newsrooms, and that's key. On the vernacular media, and I think the member's point was specifically about the Malay media, I again want to reiterate the response that I gave to earlier to Ms. Mariam Jaffar. Essentially, the vernacular media is a key part of our news media in Singapore because of the voice it gives to the different communities, no matter their size, and through that, giving them a say and a visible participation in the common space. So I think it is something that is treasured, something that we have nurtured through the years, and it is not something that we want to lose. So certainly, in the course of this transition, we would want to ensure that that commitment to our vernacular media remains. Now, how the vernacular media itself evolves, what path it takes, that I think is something we should have a more open mind about, because in the end, it has to adapt to the needs of the community, the needs of its readers, and work out a model that sustains the interests and earns the trust of the community it serves.
I'll allow two more clarifications, Mr. Pritam Singh, and then closing with Ms. Tim Pei-Ling.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Just following up from my first list of clarifications. Yes, I asked about the time when the government first informed SPH that it was prepared to extend grants to support its media business, and I also asked about the size of that grant. I would be surprised if the government hadn't considered what would be the extent of the grant that it would extend to the CLG. So can the minister share with us if there's any ballpark figure as to what is the amount of taxpayer dollar that will be going to the CLG? Minister made a point about the standards of journalism. It's not a simple issue to address in the course of a ministerial statement, but my generation at least remember this headline, this cover page in the new paper, which was in 1997, at a very sensitive time just during the elections, and it was a checklist to help you decide how to vote. Minister spoke earlier about objectivity and balance. The only thing objective about this cover page is the EPL scores, no win for Liverpool and also for Manchester United. The checklist essentially told the voters what you're voting for. If you vote for the PAP, you're voting for upgrading EduSafe and MPs of acceptable character.
Mr. Singh, if I could ask you to seek your clarification rather than expound in a speech. Thank you.
I will come to that, Deputy Speaker. Thank you, and I'll be brief. But I would agree with the Minister to the extent that one has to be fair to the journalists because they are good journalists. And a good example is on the 1st of May this year, the Chinese media group head of Chaopao, Li Huiling, she asked some very serious questions about the leadership transition to the 4G leadership. And she said internal competition is intense. There's no consensus to pick anyone. And on the other hand, the English papers, major cabinet reshuffle, but now is not the time to read the tea leaves. So there can be different views on the quality and the standards of journalism. And it is for that reason that I put my earlier question to the Minister about a select committee and to try and get some understanding from the public what they expect of a taxpayer-funded CLG. I note the comment Minister made about the surveys, but I think this is an opportunity to hear from the public, and I hope the government can consider this favorably.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm disappointed that the Leader of the Opposition has decided to make political capital out of something that I think is quite fundamentally important to us. And I think even in the examples that he cites, in a way, he has already illustrated the point that I'm making. He went back to 1997 to bring out an example, and then he says, just last year, the Chinese media put forward this year, Chinese media put one point of view, and the English media put another point of view. Isn't this the diversity that we want? Isn't it the diversity that the Leader of the Opposition has been talking about? So I am not very clear why he thinks the current model is not succeeding. Is it perfect? No. I would challenge him to show me a model that works and that is perfect. But is it one that works in our context? I think it does, with some areas for improvement, certainly. But it's an evolutionary process. And even in the examples that the leader cites, I think it's quite clear. And I would add that what we want, what we want at the end of the day is not posturing, but substance. So if we can achieve that, not just in the news media, but also in this chamber, I think we would have gone a long way to building a stronger country and nation. As for the funding, he asked for ballpark numbers, but that's precisely the problem, isn't it? I think we should be talking about these sorts of matters when we have greater clarity. Because to throw a ballpark number, and if I give you a range, then the question will be, oh, it's a very big range, can you narrow it down? And if I say, no, I can't, then we go back to square one. So the point is, I think we are doing the responsible thing here from the government's point of view. Not just to say that we support the restructuring, because we could have stopped there, but we went a step further to say that we would be prepared to fund that CLG. That is a significant point which should not be overlooked. And clearly, when the funding is finally decided upon, it will have to come back to this chamber, because it will be part of the budget of the Ministry of Communication and Information, and the member and his party would have ample opportunity to ask all the specific questions. But I think let's not miss the wood for the trees. I think it's not about the details right now, it's about the overall thrust of what we are trying to do. Is it the right thing to do? Is our news media an important public good that we should be supporting? And if so, has it done a good job up to now in the models that we have used? And if yes, then let's work with that and build on it rather than talk about a complete wholesale overhaul.
Stin Peiling.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Two clarifications. The first one in Mandarin, please. 双语政策是我们本地的教育体系非常重要的一个特征。
If you could give Minister a chance to.
It's my blunder.
Yeah.
OK，双语政策是我们本地新加坡教育体系非常重要的一个特征。那这个能够掌握双语呢，自然是能够帮助我们更好的去和我们母语的文化不会脱钩。那另外呢，也能够巩固新加坡作为一个全世界连接全世界的这个经济和文化桥梁。所以我觉得这个是非常重要。所以如果我们能够维持我们高素质的母语报章，我觉得这是非常关键的一件事情。那刚才部长有早前提到说，应该会要求这个新的重组之后保留住这个母语的一些报章。可是我想再进一步的提问，我们既然政府会注资进入这个新的这个重组的这个 CLG 里面，我们是否能够也要求他们继续的维持高素质的这个内容？这包括这个可能国际时事的报道，可是也应该包括对于时事的政治拙见他们的分析。所以希望在这一方面呢，请示部长。我们的早报好不容易能够赢得这个国际的奖章，这是得来不易的，我们应该继续支持他们。所以希望我们的部長能夠在這方面給我們一點信息。The second point is actually about establishing Singapore's thought leadership and mind share internationally. I think this is very important. So helping our papers to be able to be circulated internationally, I think, is a very critical part, in addition to the national cohesion, national public good in Singapore. So again, I would like to ask Minister whether this is something that is on the agenda or one of the parameters that we may require the new CLG to look into in the move ahead, and whether there will be resources or funding set aside to build such capabilities. Because establishing Singapore's thought leadership and mindshare internationally is important. So how can we build up that ability to ensure that we can be circulated internationally? Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank the member for her points. I think it's very important that we take this opportunity to once again reiterate the commitment to the vernacular media as part of this and any future restructuring or other changes that may occur. They are important pillars in our multi-ethnic fabric. And I think I have made the point about the important role that they play, and in particular about giving voice to the particular community. And for that reason alone, we should be focused on how we can give them not just resources, but really the motivation and ambition to be more. And I think that is the other point that the member has raised, which is from an international point of view. And for example, and I think specifically in the context of, say, the Chinese media, I am sure it would not be lost on many within the SPH organization, but also those who are going to be involved later, that our Chinese media has significant potential to not just cater to the needs of Singaporeans, but also to be able to present a perspective on international affairs. And I think it will be a very valued one because it will represent the Singapore point of view, which would be seen as being objective. And it will also be one that would be valuable to Singaporeans because it will be a chance to understand some of these international developments through the lens of Singaporeans and how they assess this in terms of its impact on us and our long-term interests. So for all those reasons, I think we will want to make sure that the vernacular media doesn't just pivot to digital, but actually develops additional important capabilities to meet this, broader need that we have. And I think this is something that I will have to defer to the CLG chairman and the members of the board and management who will then have to take this forward. But I think from a government point of view, certainly there should be no doubt as to where we stand on the issue. And I thank the member for bringing it up.